we throw this on our website afterwards. But I will start by asking folks to introduce themselves. Again, I'm not going to ask the presenters on this round, so don't feel like I forgot you. Definitely not. Sue, why don't you go first since you're my first box?
Hi, everybody. I'm Sue LaChance, and I work on our corporate engagement programs.
Great, yeah.
For the Alliance.
The Alliance, great, thanks. And Dr. Pete, welcome back. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Hopefully I'm muted. Hi, everyone. I am the regional lead for the Army Research Laboratory across the West Coast. It's great to be here. Good to see everyone.
Thank you, thank you. And Jim from UCR, how's it going?
Good morning, everyone. Jim Yano, I'm the Associate Director for Corporate and Strategic Partnerships here with the University of California, Riverside. It's a real pleasure to be with you this morning. I will need to drop off a little bit early, but appreciate SoCal Innovation's outreach to everyone here in UC Riverside for our participation. Thank you.
Oh, great, thanks, Jim, appreciate it. And Sean Cochran, you're up.
Hey everybody, Sean Cochran. I'm doing tech scouting for Special Operations Command. So active duty Army officer, and just a pleasure to be here and to meet everyone. So thank you.
All right, thanks, Sean. Edward.
Hey, good morning. So I'm Edward Palzo. I'm with ARL's Army Research Office, which is a basic research extramural group. And I run the Army's program for social and cognitive networks. And I am sitting in Orange County, so building the community in this area as well. Thank you.
Fantastic, fantastic. Good to meet you, actually. I've heard from you before. Letitia, welcome back. Hey, how's it going?
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be back. I'm Leticia Toledo Sherman. I'm Senior Director of Drug Discovery for the Rainwater Charitable Foundation, and I lead the drug discovery efforts for the Tau Consortium, which is a consortia looking at restoring neurodegenerative disease, pathology in patients with tauopathies. And I'm glad to be here.
Great. Letitia was our moderator for our last one we had on neurology. So we do every other, is like sort of tech or life science. This one's actually a nice blend of both. So I thought we could get some more overlap with that. Great. And Russell.
Hi. So I'm having some video problems, or else I'd turn that on. I'm Russell Cohnhoffing. I'm a researcher at Army Research Labs, and I do a lot of eye tracking research and working on transitioning some of the work I'm doing into tech and such.
Great. Welcome. Hey, Katie. How's it going?
Sorry, I'm muted. Good, thanks. I'm Katie Cameron. I'm at the Alliance, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's a very impressive group.
Thanks, Katie. So last but not least, Andy Wilson, our Phyllis leader.
Hey, all, just came to wish you good morning. I'm Andy Wilson. I'm the Executive Director of the Alliance, and excited to learn new things about breakthroughs and hear more about what you're doing. And thanks again for joining us, and especially the PIs who are sharing the research. I get tingly about the amazing stuff that's going on in Southern California. So good morning and welcome.
Thanks, Andy. And now I'll introduce Z Holly, who's our Phyllis moderator, partner at Good Growth Capital, an entrepreneur, a instigator, podcast host, I don't know, amongst many things, a skydiver, and a fearless champion of innovation in the community. So Z has agreed and helped basically on help us, good to help us, but also as our fearless sort of instigator of this particular conversation. Thought, wouldn't it be neat if we did something on human behavior? So glad you took this challenge with us. And Z, would you like me to? Will you sort of briefly just introduce the? I guess you can just introduce them as you call on them of the research. But we have a great group here, and I could do it for you if you'd like. But
yeah, why don't you go ahead and introduce each of the speakers really briefly, and then I can just kind of tee up the session.
Fantastic. So we have Sumner Norman from Caltech, and your title is. What is your title these days, Sumner? Actually.
Listening to the Brain was the rebranded title. Yeah, we'll get into what that means.
Of your actual of your speak. Yeah, exactly.
Oh, you mean my professional title?
Your professional title, yeah.
Oh, okay, sure, yeah. I'm a postdoctoral scholar, the Della Martin postdoctoral scholar at Division of Biology and Biological Engineering at Caltech.
Fantastic. Okay, great. Like I wasn't sure because I didn't think I had the actually updated one in the Word doc there. And we have next up Aaron Seitz, Professor of Psychology, Director of UCR Brain Game Center, and the Director of UCR Aging Initiative at UC Riverside. Did I get that right, Aaron? Is that anything I missed? That's good. Okay, great, thanks. And after that, we'll have Sean Young. He's the founder and executive director of the University of California Institute for Prediction Technology, and also the author of Stick With It, a scientifically proven process for changing your life for good. And Sean's actually at UCI. I think you probably have a UCI title as well. I probably missed there too.
Yes, and I am associate professor in the departments of emergency medicine and informatics in the School of SES.
That's great. Thank you, Sean. And last but not least, of course, Sarah Roberts, associate professor, information studies, and the co-director of the Center for Critical Internet Inquiry at UCLA. Good. Okay, I got that. Fantastic. All right, so Z, I'll let you kick it off, and we'll good luck.
Yeah, so I'm Z, and I'm a venture partner with Good Growth Capital. We invest in early stage complex science and technology startups. And just to give a little context of how Steve and I put together this session, 15 years ago, I was running a Center for Innovation at MIT, and when I received a call from USC to recruit me to be the vice provost for innovation, I thought, well, it's really hard to leave my alma mater, love MIT, but there was so much opportunity in LA. And once I came to LA, never looked back. I was like a kid in a candy store, because I think, over my career, I've learned that the most exciting things happen at the edges and intersections of disciplines and cultures. And there's definitely no more diverse place, rich with research and ideas than here in LA. Our local universities, as many of you know, do well over $2 billion in research. And today, for example, we're going to hear from 4 local academics spanning from biological engineering, psychology, informatics, social sciences, et cetera. There's just so many different ways that we can think about technology, innovation, data. And when we think about innovation, we often think about it as just being about technology. But innovation isn't just about gadgets or data. It's really about, the way I think about it, is about harnessing imagination, and not just our own, but everyone's imagination. You can't turn ideas into impact without living at the intersection of technology and human nature. And so this session is about data, because we felt like there is no company, no technologist, no business that doesn't deal with data, but we wanted to look at the human side of data. So everything from deep inside the brain, the way we learn, how we get interface to the brain, all the way to our social interactions as a community on a grand scale. And so I'm really excited to hear from our guests who are pioneering these new ways to understand and influence human behavior. And so after each of our, as Steve mentioned, after each of our speakers speak for a bit, we'll have an opportunity to maybe ask 1, maybe 2 clarifying questions if we have time after each one. And then we'll then really dive in afterwards. We'll have about 20 minutes at the end to be able to dive into some of the thornier issues and questions and hear from everybody. So yeah, so it's really great to be here. Thank you so much for the platform to help pull together these really interesting innovations. So we'll start with Sumner Norman, if you don't mind sharing your screen and doing your talk.
Sure thing. All right, that should be up now. Let me know if it's not. Yeah, so I guess as I already introduced the title and my title, I'm Sumner Norman, a postdoc at Caltech, and I design neural interfaces. So the title of my talk is Listening to the Brain. But before I get into that, I want to tell you a little bit about brain-machine interfaces. So this is Eric. Eric is actually paralyzed from the neck down, and he has been for over a decade now. So we implanted Eric with 200 electrodes that can sense the single neurons in his brain firing. And we put those electrode arrays in areas of his brain that are associated with movement planning. And so from the activity of those individual neurons, we can start to infer what his intention is. So put simply, if you have one neuron that fires when he wants to move to the right, another when he wants to move up, and with enough neurons put together, we can start to recreate his intention using a robotic limb. So Eric said once he had a brain-machine interface, the first thing he wanted to do was to drink a beer. So this is him with my colleague Tyson sharing a beer for the first time, and I think 14 years when this video was taken. So I love seeing it because the elation on his face really never gets old. So these brain-machine interfaces could control just about anything. From robotic limbs, we have another patient that she really likes to create art in Photoshop, and so she uses that interface quite a bit. In this video taken last year, another one of our participants, JJ, is playing a first-person video game, and this is nothing but neural signals here. And so from this video, you'd probably never know that JJ has been paralyzed for about 6 years. And frankly, I think he'd beat me at the game as well. So we think it's pretty clear that electrodes can be transformative for people with really severe motor impairments like this. But the thing is that not many people are completely paralyzed. These are really difficult surgeries that they have to undergo. And I'm sure you saw in Eric's head, these pedestals coming out of his skull. So ideally, we'd be able to give this same type of ability back to people who had suffered any kind of neurological injury or disease, whether that's cognitive or neuropsychiatric in nature. And those indications far, far outnumber those with severe paralysis. But like I was mentioning, those implants like Eric and JJ have are really invasive. They require multiple surgeries. They don't last more than a few years. So these people are really pioneers because they're undergoing some serious surgeries for the sake of science. But ideally, these brain-machine interface recording techniques would be minimally invasive, they'd be portable, and they'd last a lifetime. So in 2010, our collaborators pioneered a new technique called functional ultrasound neuroimaging. So conventional ultrasound scans line by line to reconstruct a single image. We use plane wave imaging. So that means with one pulse, we can create an entire image from the echo. And that means that we can go really, really fast. In fact, we record about 15,000 images per second rather than the kind of 50 that you might get with normal ultrasound. We then use the Doppler frequency shifts across many of these images to detect the motion of red blood cells. So just like an ambulance coming towards you is higher pitched and lower pitched as it goes away, our transducers hear the red blood cells approaching or going away. And this is important. Because we track that blood flow down to microscopic resolution, we see capillary beds and arterioles that are perfusing tiny, tiny populations of neurons. So as a group of neurons fire, we can hear that happening in our images. So hence the title of this talk, Listening to the Brain. So here you can see how ultrasound precisely detects signals throughout a mouse brain. And in fact, it's about 20 times more sensitive to hemodynamics than fMRI. And it does that at resolutions that are up to 800 times smaller than MRI. And ultrasound's small, so it's about the size of a quarter, as you can see here in our last study. So it can be portable, it's relatively low cost, especially compared to an MR scanner. It does still require removing a small piece of the skull, but unlike Eric's electrodes, it stays outside of the dura and it never damages a single cell of brain tissue. So it's very, very safe. And I just really want to drive the point home here that I just generally think that ultrasound produces some of the most kind of beautiful images of the brain vasculature that I've ever seen. So because it's based on the Doppler effect, like I mentioned, you can encode the direction of the blood flow as well. So it's very good as an angiographic technique. So I just like to show these images. When I came to Caltech, I was really set on finding a new brain recording technique for brain-machine interfacing. So my first hurdle was to prove that this ultrasound technique, which had previously worked in small animals, mice mostly, to work in large animals. So we started working with rhesus macaque monkeys. So this is a coronal MRI slice. You can see this ultrasound plane in red here that we use for this experiment. We record again outside the dura. So we're above the brain in an area called the parietal cortex that's really important for movement planning. So I then trained our monkeys to perform these different eye and hand movements, and then asked, given that brain data alone, can I predict what the monkey's about to do? just like we do with Eric and JJ. So the answer was yes. This is a confusion matrix where our prediction is shown on the y-axis and the monkey's actual choice is shown on the x-axis. So if it was a perfect diagonal, that would be perfect. And we were getting quite close. So first, we were able to predict when the monkey was about to move, but before he moved. And we can do that with nearly perfect accuracy. We didn't stop there. We can also decode whether the monkey is going to move his eyes or his hand or some other effector. And we can tell which direction he's going to move that effector as well. And we can do all of those things together we can do all those things correctly about 80% of the time. And we're getting actually much better. And since this paper's come out, we're well into the 90% pretty routinely now. And then really, ultrasound resolution and field of view are really, really critical for this work. So it was published recently in Neuron, and I'd be happy to chat more about what makes ultrasound really special from a technological point of view, or you can check out the paper, but I'm just really optimistic about what it can do. Eric and JJ have to go through this tedious process every day when they come in. So in fact, every few hours, if their session is long enough with the BCI connected, then we actually have to recalibrate them. But with ultrasound, because it's looking at larger areas of the brain, we're now using deep learning techniques where ultrasound BMIs can work using a single model. And that one model can work over really long periods of time without recalibration. And it could even be shared between people. We're also working on 4D images, that's 3D images through time, which opens up this kind of whole new realm of possibilities for decoding brain data. The only trick there is dealing with the 50 gigabytes of data per second. And what I'm really excited about is that we're already using this technology in humans. So these are the first functional ultrasound images of an awake and behaving human, which we just took last week. So this is like hot off the press. And this is just one example. We're already using ultrasound neuroimaging in 2 indications and with some plans to expand from there. So just to summarize, we have this new method of imaging brain function, which it really broke it was a revolution in ultrasound imaging. And we proved that it can detect high dimensional brain function, and it's really quite effective at it. And we're now establishing a pipeline for clinical testing. And I'll just wrap up there by saying thanks to all of my collaborators and everyone at Caltech that made this possible, some of which have now moved on to other universities. And thank you all for listening.
Wow, that's really exciting. So tell us a little bit about where you think what the timeline is looking like for commercialization of this kind of technology.
Rapidly advancing. I think if you would have asked me that question 3 or 4 years ago when I was getting started, I would have guessed it was more on the decade timescale. Now I think we're in single-digit years before this is used commonly in clinic. And in fact, we're already using it at USC in clinic, and the results are really phenomenal. So I would guess for some indications, especially semi-chronic monitoring or intraoperative monitoring, those sorts of things, almost immediately.
Wow. And what's the biggest hurdle right now for it to be used more commonly?
Right now, you need a PhD to run the thing. So
productization.
Productization. That's exactly right. Yep.
Okay. Sounds great. We'll have a chance to talk a little bit more about it too, but let's jump into the next talk. Thank you so much. So Aaron Seitz, Professor of Psychology and Director of the UCR Brain Game Center.
Thanks. Let me share my screen. See if this works. Are you able to see it?
Yes.
Excellent. So, so this talk will be almost completely different. What I want to tell you about is some of the work we're doing at the Brain Game Center at UC Riverside, and that kind of our broader mission really is to kind of design, test, and disseminate evidence-based approaches to understand and train brain fitness. And the real goal is to do this in a way that is respective of real life activities that people do. And so as somebody who my kind of background is computational neuroscience and systems neuroscience, and everything I'm going to tell you about today is translational approach of how can we take things that have worked in the lab and translate them so that they work on mobile platforms and are effective in the world. And there's two major components of my research. One is brain training that I'll mention briefly at the end. And the other is brain testing. And that this work, and I'll kind of mention some of the projects briefly, is funded by about 14 different NIH grants. And so there's a lot of different aspects. I really want to give you an idea of what are some of the core ideas. And so one of the first ideas is that if you look historically at, let's say, neuropsych exams, that they have been decades on paper-based tests. So here's like a classic clock drawing task. And that these approaches have been appropriate in order to be able to get some basic information of whether maybe someone has dementia or not. They don't provide as much detailed information about somebody's cognitive status, especially kind of within the healthy range or changes over time to the extent that we would want. And that there's a movement, and we're part of this, of trying to digitize measures. And this can both make them more available in that people can run these on their own computers, tablets, smartphones, et cetera. But also they give a lot more detailed information because we measure every single movement of the player. So for instance, with the clock drawing task, we don't just have, what does the clock look like? We have all the fine details of their attempts to draw it and that time course. And that really briefly, we work on quite a large number of tests. So we've developed new hearing tests, vision tests, neuropsych tests, cognitive control tests, fluid intelligence tests. We use machine learning in order to be able to make these more efficient. So one thing which one might note is that almost any task that you have people perform, there will be some correlations between them. If you take advantage of these correlations, then you could speed up a battery of tasks by 50 or 100 times if you do it right. And that you could also start, as you conduct your measurements, try to do this within some understanding of a criteria. So if you want to determine whether somebody is better or worse than they were a previous day, you can do that much more efficiently than if you're trying to understand the cognitive profile in the first place. If you're trying to understand whether that risk for some sort of condition, Parkinson, dementia, et cetera, that once again, you can do this much more efficiently than the typical approach where you basically try to just get individual thresholds on a bunch of tasks. And just a brief example of where we make some breakthroughs is that take like audiology. So the typical audiology approach is that you have an audiologist who is a well-paid individual, run a participant in a sound shielded booth, which is also very expensive and not super accessible. And that they typically do simple tasks where they kind of raise their hand when you hear a pure tone and you measure whether their hearing is good or not by that. About 50% of people who have hearing problems do fine on standard audiological measures. We've developed this app called PART, so Portable Adaptive Rapid Testing. So this runs on an iPad or an iPhone, an Android tablet. And that's super quick. We've been able to show that, starting with audiological exam, we would get basically the same results if we test people at home, just on standard consumer equipment than in the lab. But also there's now a whole battery of tests that we're able to run that typically have not been done in audiological clinics because you now can basically do more detailed tests in a home environment. Other things we're looking at is, what do we move to VR? So going back to this issue where why do people perform well when they get their hearing tested, but then complain that they can't hear well in a noisy restaurant? Well, part of the reason is that at a standard hearing test, you're in this nice quiet room, you're spending all your attention listening to particular sounds that you know are coming. And so you do pretty well there, as opposed to in reality, we basically have all these constant distractions. We don't know necessarily when the sound that we have to listen to is going to come. And so what we're looking at, and we have another grant focused on this, is looking at how both VR, where we could basically have better simulations of reality, and then also gamification, can give rise to hearing tests that involve more distraction, more multisensory cues, and to test how each of these changes the extent to which the hearing tests better or worse predict self-report. The other thing that we're looking into is this idea of stealth testing. And so, as we basically collect all these measures, well, what if we measure somebody's computer use, keystrokes, mouse movements, or orthography, or physiological monitoring from a smartwatch, record sound or video, or we've even worked with companies looking at the industrial Internet of Things, where you could basically take measurements from their machines. And if that could predict performance on the standard cognitive tasks, then you could basically get some of these same measurements just from what people are doing, as opposed to having to do explicit testing. And so I mentioned real briefly that, there's also brain training. And so just to give you an idea of the types of training studies we're looking at. So one grant that we have is to try to run 30,000 people in working memory training. So working memory training typically is a paradigm where you have each individual take 7 to 10 hours of doing some sort of computerized training task. And then you measure performance before and after on some outcome measures. Typical studies, will run 50 people, then make some conclusion that, this will make you smarter, or another conclusion might be this won't make you smarter. And looking at this literature, it's an extremely complicated space where there's lots of companies making broad claims. There's the federal government that, has taken action against some of them, and that there's also lots of examples where it can be beneficial. And so what we're trying to do with this large data set is not say, does working memory training work? It's, well, what types of training work for which people and give rise to which outcomes? And so that going to a personalized approach, where it might be the case that somebody who has a age-related cognitive impairment might gain from a certain type of training, and someone else might not gain from the type of training. And so looking at the details as opposed to making just, gross kind of population generalizations, I think is really the key to move forward in this field. And that just this gives an idea of some of the projects we're working on. So we have some projects that are focused on kids. So we have a grant from the EF Plus Math Foundation, where we're using executive function tests to try to improve math outcomes, especially for Black and Latinx kids. We work with some companies trying to see whether we can improve, productivity, safety, and well-being. We have lots of studies looking at older adults to try to either better diagnose them or to give rise to better cognitive outcomes. Looking at hearing tests, looking at VR, looking at low vision, a number of clinical populations, schizophrenia, autism is another one. For cancer patients, looking at whether we could train impulse control and see whether that will help with healthy eating. Actually, Russell Cohen-Hoffing helped invent one of the protocols we're using there, who's on this call. And then I think I'm out of my time. So thank you, and I look forward to questions.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, I was definitely the personalization piece. We may even dig into that a little bit later in our group discussion. But I'm wondering if you can make a general kind of a generalization of, are there big differences, or how do you approach, I would think, the testing and learning in situations in people with pathologies where you're trying to fix or diagnose a pathology versus folks that are a little bit more, like, hey, I'm just an average person who wants to understand more about my personality and my learning skill and style and that type of thing. Is there a big difference in those two realms, or can you learn about both? Can you translate across both?
So there are differences, but I think the same approaches can be used for both. But this gets to the machine learning approaches that I described, where if instead, like the standard approach is, let's take a bunch of tests, they'll each measure something, and we'll look at those measurements. Instead, what you could do is, what is the question you're trying to ask? So basically treat it as a classification question. And then basically have it so that online, you dish out the tests that are appropriate to inform that classification. And so that way, every patient might get a different set of tests, because the algorithm needs to determine which test is going to tell the most information about that potential pathology that they might have. And so that is a much more efficient approach than if you're just going to take 8 hours, do a bunch of testing, and then try to see how these things add up. And then also, it becomes the same type of approach if you want to get a very detailed estimate, because you're basically now trying to classify something else. You might want to say, well, did this person get 1% better? Okay, maybe you have to get more data to make that determination. But from the broader computational perspective, it's the same. And so I think moving from having threshold-based assessments to classification-based assessments, I think actually is going to be the key to better diagnostics in general, and then, but also leading to, better treatments.
Great. Well, we'll dig into that more in a moment. Just a reminder to everyone, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And we may not get to them immediately after each of the talks, but it'll definitely help me guide the conversation afterwards too. So feel free. Thank you so much, Aaron. Sean Young, founder and executive director of the University of California Institute for Prediction Technology, and also an author of Stick With It, a scientifically proven process for changing your life for good.
All right. The screen share is not linking with my PowerPoint. That's weird. Let me try. Is there someone else you can go? I'm going to try to link this so I can screen share. Or am I the...
If you email it to me, I can also maybe, and actually the person who's hosting maybe is better.
Yeah. Sean, while you're maybe figuring that out, also I just put all the emails in there of all the different presenters. For those of you are attending, you want to follow for later communications, I put that in the chat. So please check that out and you can email them directly.
Great. And we have a question in the chat. So maybe while Sean tries to bring up his slides, shall we ask Aaron the question? Is that cool? We'll do you have thoughts on Edward Palzolo says, do you have thoughts on social learning where people learn, train in teams?
Yeah, so I think quite a few thoughts. One is that the way I think about learning is what is the particular skill that may be necessary in order to function better. And so I do think that some individualized training can actually help with teamwork. But I also think that my general approach is I try to take my understanding of how learning works in the brain and apply it to different problems. And so I think that from the social problem, I think that one can come up with kind of ways to draw attention and reinforcement to the things that are important to learn for the team that would give rise to better outcomes. And I'd be happy to talk about that offline because it's detailed.
Great.
Good. It sounds like looks like we have the presentation ready. So Sean, take it away.
Are you able to see that? I sort of
yes.
Jimmy rigged it to do part of the screen. Okay, great. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Good morning. This is also going to be a different switch to talk about social technologies for health behavioral assessment and change. I'll start. I'm going to breeze through and talk about a number of different areas. This first one will be about digital health behavior change. And this is an area, so if we're trying to get people to change their behaviors, we've created, I created what's called the Harnessing Online Peer Education Intervention, HOPE Intervention, which is an online community. Here's an example of what we did for HIV, starting, this was back more than 10 years ago. It's an online community where we train peer role models from the community and the science, the psychology of how do you reach out to strangers online and get them to change their attitudes and behaviors. And then over, it was originally a 12-week intervention. We've got it down to about 6 weeks. We train these peer leaders in 3 training sessions on the fundamentals they need to know about some specific area of disease or behavior change, in this case, HIV. They then are able to persuade others in this online community to change their attitudes and behaviors too. We find, like this study here, compared to a control group, those in our intervention online community had about 2 to 3 times as much behavior change, about 2 to 3 times as likely in this case to get tested for HIV, self-test. We've done this in different countries, parts of the world, in South America. We've done it for different disease areas. This is HIV. We've done it for substance use, opioid use disorder, mental health, anxiety. We recently just finished one to increase COVID vaccinations among unvaccinated healthcare workers. So pretty consistently, though, finding that 2 to 3 times increase compared to a control group. Now, it's important that it's not about the technology. We've run these on Facebook groups. We've run it on our own online community platform. And the news headline used to always be, from the first study, Facebook can increase HIV testing. It's not about the platform. It's about integrating the science into it. There needs to be a theory, guiding theory, a framework of how to incorporate psychology with the technology. Just because you bring people in engaging technology, that's not going to change their behavior the way you want. It's got to incorporate the right psychology. And so this is a framework that I use, and it's in a book I wrote called Stick With It, where different behaviors, there are 3 different types of behaviors, what I call automatic, burning, and common behaviors. And then there are a different set of tools from psychology that are used for changing each of those types of behaviors. Now I'm going to shift topics to our AI work. I backed into doing AI research because in order to be able to change people's behavior, you have to be able to understand what's happening. You have to be able to, we need better monitoring tools or even prediction tools. So here's an example. There was a place in rural Indiana where there were there was an HIV epidemic, and started with 2 people presenting to a clinic who were infected, turned into 5, 10, 20. Pretty soon in this small rural area, there were 200 people infected in an area of 4,000 people. What was happening is that data kept on being reported to a higher level from the city to the county to the state to the CDC, and we couldn't get ahead of things and predict it. So we wanted to look at how social data, which provides information about people's behavior, might be used as a tool for predicting, in this case, HIV, and then I'll show you some other examples. So one type of social data is social media data, where every day there's, this is an old stat from a couple of years ago, there are about 500 million tweets that are sent. This is an old stat, probably at the time about 400 million were from President Trump, but there's still 55 million status updates on Facebook. There's a ton of, there's 700 million snaps. And so what we want to look at is, are these posts on social media, can we actually infer something about people's attitudes and health behaviors? And we found people will publicly share all kinds of personal information about themselves. They'll tell you they're drunk driving, the drugs that they're using. They will tell you personal things, like in this case about experiences HIV. They'll tell you Jay wants to have sex tonight. They'll tell you about things relevant to A1C levels and diabetes. So in putting all this together, and how do we collect and analyze the hundreds of millions of data points happening every day? We did an early study that we did focused on that HIV question, was to be able to see, could the posts where people are providing information saying they are engaging in things that would put them at risk for HIV, like engaging in unprotected sex, stimulant drug use, could that predict HIV cases? And we found it could. Counties where people are talking about things that suggest they'll be at risk for HIV had higher rates of HIV cases, controlling for a whole bunch of other things. We've also done this in schools at an individual level. We gave students wearable devices to track sleep and activity. We collected their tweets and we gave them weekly surveys to monitor their stress levels, their sleep patterns. And we found here examples of their tweets, positive and negative tweets, and with the different activity bands and things. And we found that we could be able to predict the report at the end of the week of their stress or their sleep patterns, we could predict that using their Twitter data, using their wearable device data. And then what do we do in terms of there's so much data, how do we automate this? Well, using deep learning methods, we developed applications like this that could in real time be able to monitor how students are feeling based on this information across different schools. We've done this in a lot of different areas and with different types of social data. So for example, with the opioid crisis, we looked at Google data, Google Internet search data, and opioid data, and we found that cities where there are spikes in internet searches for opioids, whether they're prescription opioids, Suboxone, to non-prescription, just street names like China White, in cities where there are spikes for these internet searches on about opioids, 1 year later, we see spikes in those same cities for emergency department visits for heroin. And so that's an example of how to use internet search data to predict different outcomes. We've done this during COVID, during the current pandemic. We've looked at mobility data, cell phone mobility data, where people are going to predict transmission rates, to predict adherence to whether they stay at home. We've also developed interventions based on this to get people to increase adherence and work with public health departments and the CDC on this. We've also been looking in how do we monitor and predict misinformation. There's an example of a study we did in response to President Trump prior to announcing he had COVID, 5 days later announcing he had COVID, and then 5 days later announcing, don't worry about it, this is not a big issue. And then the public's changing sentiment, which we detected on Twitter based on a public figure like this, and how severity, if you look in this box over here, prior to him saying it, about 67% of people thought it was serious. Then when he said he had COVID, it went up to 95%. And then after he said, don't worry about it, it went back down. So this is an example of how we can use social media, again, for monitoring people's misinformation and other information about the public. More broadly, what we do is we work with government agencies and then analyze the data using different AI methods and come up with maps and tools like this to help them. I'll end off. These are some just broad strokes of areas of research, and here are some others that we do. We study the ethics of all of this, and there are specific applications that we're working on related to people's ethical views of this. We develop hackathons and applications that crowdsource people's opinions and beliefs to be able to inform future data about people's health behaviors. Developed devices for behavior change, and we've done some work with autonomous vehicle safety and VR and AR. All right, I will stop there.
Great, thank you. We're running a tad behind, so but we'll have plenty of time to ask questions in the group thing. But it did not escape me when you talked about the happiness by school. Difference between MIT and the others. Not everyone's happy at MIT, apparently. Okay, so great, thank you. And then Sarah Roberts, Associate Professor, Information Studies and Co-Director, Center for Critical Internet Inquiry at UCLA.
Whoa, let me get my screen going here. And I will... Let's see, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
And are you just seeing the slides? Or are you seeing a weird interface?
We're seeing both. We're seeing the next one as well.
Okay, let me try to just do a regular old, how's that?
Yes, great.
Okay, great. So yeah, Monty Python now for something completely different. That's what we're going to talk about here to close this out. I am a researcher at UCLA in the social sciences, and my focus for the past decade plus has been on commercial content moderation. What is commercial content moderation? Well, there was a time when I really had to go into a great deal of explanation to make this make sense. But in 2021, I think just about everyone has heard of or has even perhaps interacted with the process of content moderation of social media. And so my focus is on the people, practice, and politics of this particular activity, which I would summarize as basically the adjudication and decision-making around what material stays online and stays available on major social media platforms and what material is rescinded, removed, or otherwise downgraded and may not circulate as freely. It may come as a surprise to you that much of this work, even in 2021, is done by human beings. And when we're thinking about the issues of data, we're talking about massive amounts of data. And I would actually, kind of start the discussion by saying all of us are somewhat implicated in these processes. And what you're looking at here is a screenshot. This is an older screenshot, but I keep it around because it's so perfect, from YouTube's interface. If you've ever been online and you've had occasion, as many of us have, to come across something that you found disturbing, problematic, maybe graphically violent, something that was unexpected, something that contained an attack on someone else, you yourself may have started the process of commercial content moderation by reporting that material through the reporting mechanisms of each platform. Each one is different. So there's no kind of standard interface here, but it's down to users to go and find how to navigate through what are really decision trees. So already as human beings, whether we're the user or on the other end receiving these reports, you can see that there's kind of a computational logic at play here, that you would actually navigate down this decision tree, kind of choose, okay, I've decided it's violent or repulsive content. Now I have to further indicate within there what type of violent or repulsive content it is, and so on and so forth. And from a user perspective, that goes off somewhere. Maybe you never think about it or interact with it again. But in fact, it's the beginning of a series of events behind the scenes and behind the screen that take place at these social media companies thousands upon thousands of times a day. To give you an idea of the kind of problem space that we're talking about, this is a stat from 2017. This is the amount of user-generated content that YouTube publicly announced they received every single minute of every single day. They were receiving 400 hours of video material being uploaded to their platforms constantly, without really any break in that flow. As you can imagine, this being from 2017, this amount has only increased. I've heard through the grapevine that the stat that's kind of bandied about there now is 550 hours of content. This one was an official number, so I like to use that. But now think about every single platform out there that is predicated on the circulation of user-generated content, and you quickly see the magnitude of the problem of trying to adjudicate this content when it goes afoul of the rules. It's it's trying to empty the ocean with a teacup, essentially. From some number of years ago, a reporting guide was released by Facebook, and I don't expect you to really get into this deeply, other than to get again a visual of what these human moderators were doing back in. This came out in 2012, and it's still largely the case that human moderators followed, again, these decision trees. So you saw the beginning of the decision tree on the reporting side, but once the human moderators receive those reports that we trigger by our own activity, they themselves go through a series of decision trees based on things like internal policy to the company, but also local law You know, so the enforcement of content moderation is across the board, kind of a gamut of seriousness, whether it's, you know, sort of a violation of the community norms, someone just kind of crossing or towing over the line, all the way to needing to bring law enforcement into the process. And that's especially when we're talking about things like child sexual abuse material and other kinds of illegal activity that for inexplicable reasons, people like to often video and upload to the internet. And so the important thing to recognize here in this graph too, is that everything you see here, things like threats of vandalism, graphic violence, illegal drug use, self-harm is a big one, suicidal ideation and suicidal content, et cetera, are things that the individuals who work in this field are exposed to every day. And for those of you who have any experience yourself in stressful or disturbing contexts, I know we have a lot of military folks here, so I'm thinking of you, that kind of exposure to content that is disturbing obviously has deleterious effects on workers' well-being. In some cases, workers have reported symptoms that are very similar and may well be post-traumatic stress disorder. And, you know, I am not a psychiatrist, so I don't like to diagnose that, but I'm a human being and I recognize these experiences as they're reported to me. So this is a very high pressure, fast-paced job where the content never ends. There's never a point at which somebody can kind of, you know, wipe their hands clean and walk away knowing they've completed reviewing all of the bad content that exists on the internet and it's done. It will constantly be there. The queues constantly fill up with new reports. And of course, we are on the front end of generating those reports. And so this becomes a very difficult job to manage, made more difficult by some of the particular contexts. Whoops, sorry, I just hit a bunch of, what happened there? Hold on a sec, folks, I gotta go back. I touched my mouse and it went wild. So here we go. So I wanna tell you a little bit about the different worksite types where this work takes place. There are workers who do this at the major firms themselves. They sit inside those firms. They may work alongside others like engineers and so on, but they often have a differential status. They are often relegated to a contractor status. This means they have, you know, they joke with me, they can't use the climbing wall, for example, but they often have very poor benefits. Maybe no health insurance, in fact, when I was interviewing some of these workers some number of years ago. They were also paid at a far lower wage for what is really mission critical work. And there, again, there's a kind of a gamut of how this gets set up as well, going from kind of the best scenario, which is often that in-house setting, even though that differential status often exists, to a call center like setting, which has become actually the predominating modality that you will see this work take place in today, all the way down to something like a micro labor website, Amazon Mechanical Turk, where workers might just engage with one piece of content for an unknown party, make a decision about it and move on to the next, sometimes for a penny or two per view. So as I said, this work, when I first became interested in it, I tracked to Silicon Valley. And I say I tracked it because it was very difficult to get the firms to even admit that this work was going on. The reason for that was because the firms themselves had predicated their social media platforms on the basis of sort of like unfettered free expression. And so to announce that they had legions of workers who were necessary to remove content that was so abhorrent that it might turn off the rest of the populace from being on these platforms was something they were not willing to discuss. So it took a lot of work to find people willing to talk to me. I found some folks in Silicon Valley at a company called Megatech. And for years, I have had people from just about every company you see on this slide and more come up to me at parties and say, our company is Megatech, isn't it? Which tells me that all of these firms are dealing with the same set of problems to a certain extent. Of course, I've never confirmed or denied it, so they walk away paranoid. During the time that I researched this over the past decade, we saw a great shift in the workflow itself. So this is a map of shipping lanes back from the 1920s that show, sort of these routes going to the Philippines in particular and to East and Southeast Asia in general. And I want you to imagine a bunch of undersea data cables because they are traveling very similar routes. And what we're seeing now is American-based firms outsourcing much of this screening task labor to places like the Philippines, which has become an incredibly important center of this human data screening work, in no small part because of the longstanding relationship the United States has had with the Philippines, one of colonial dominance, of course. Many Filipino people speaking colloquial American English, and they have an incredibly robust series of infrastructural, what they call IT ecozones, set up to do this kind of auxiliary data work for the United States. So much of this data is now flowing to the Philippines for adjudication, and it comes back to the platforms to be dispersed wherever in the world it may be, or it gets removed at that stage. What is the work like for these folks? Well, here again, I indicated it is a very difficult job. Max Breen was someone I spoke to who worked at Megatech. He said he had a hard time leaving the job at the door. He took it home with him. He actually reported to me that he was really someone who could handle it. He could take it, no problem. And then in the next breath kind of told me that he had started drinking quite a great deal since he had taken on this job and was having intimacy problems with his partner. His colleague, Josh Santos, who also, and by the way, these were both highly educated grads of, Josh was himself a USC grad. Max was a grad of a liberal arts college, an exclusive liberal arts college. Unfortunately, both of them had majored in things like history and econ, not in STEM. And so this is kind of where they could get their foot in the door in Silicon Valley. Josh said to me, he felt like he spent 8 hours in a hole of filth, and he really didn't want to bring it into the rest of his life. This meant that he was avoiding social situations with friends who did not work in this industry. He didn't want to talk about his work. And for the most part, these workers are all covered in non-disclosure agreements anyway. So they are not supposed to really be talking and revealing the nature of the work that they do, which is treated as an industrial secret.
Super interesting. I want to make sure that we have time for the discussion with everyone. Yeah. So yeah, if you could maybe in a couple minutes.
This is it. So where does that leave us? Automation. Why isn't this automated? Where's the computation, right? And this is the big question. When I started this research, I went and I asked a computer vision researcher, hey, could computers conceivably deal with this at scale? And he pointed to a wooden table in his visualization lab, and he said, right now I'm working on making the computer reliably know that that table is a table. Okay, that was in 2010. The state of the art for computer vision and machine learning is well beyond where we were then. And yet and still, this activity cannot be fully turned over to computation and automation because of a number of reasons, one of which is that it requires so much infrastructure, engineering, and compute power to do at scale that it's a barrier to market entry for many companies. You will hear Mark Zuckerberg ask for regulation that demands computation on adjudication of social media because he wants to keep others out of the market. So listen carefully when you hear him talk. But the other reason is that computation tools that do this kind of adjudication cannot operate on their own. They tend to make mistakes. So you have data set sorters and labelers on the front end trying to make sense of these data sets that are used for machine learning. And yet and still, I want to let you know that this next image is somewhat disturbing. You have images like this, the terror of war from the Vietnam era, constantly getting deleted because the machine learning based computational tools find this to be child pornography because of the naked body of this child who's been burned with napalm. Of course, this is a very disturbing image, but not for that reason, and it's historically significant. So when there are mistakes, this kind of thing made it on the front pages of several European papers that it kept getting taken down. And I'll leave it there. I'm happy to talk about any and all aspects of this, the human-machine interface and connection, and the problems that are facing industry with commercial content moderation today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that perspective. I think we heard so many different perspectives on the human side of data, and finishing with, hey, it's not just technology. Not only is it not just about technology, sometimes technology will not solve our problems, and we have a ways to go. Thanks to those of you who've put some questions in the chat. Feel free to put more in there. Let's well, I don't know if you want to spotlight the folks, the speakers or not, but let me bring up a couple of questions for the group. In particular, it seems like there are some questions around the limitation, Sumner, of your technology, but I might throw it out also to the whole group of what are the limitations and what technologies are going to be critical for these your approaches to be adopted. We had, sorry, who was it who asked? Sam had asked, you know, in particular, did you say that it takes 50 gigabytes per second to record the 4D imaging? So that's going to be, obviously storage is going to be a big issue. So Sumner, why don't we start with you, talk a little bit about what are the technological requirements for what you're doing?
Yes, so 50 gigabit per second is a huge amount of data if you needed to store all of the raw radio frequency data. We almost never do that unless we're actually developing the imaging sequence. Once we've developed the imaging sequence, then we'll compress that data and form those into images. So yeah, it's a lot of hard drive space, but you don't need to store the data. And we process most of it online. What we actually save out in the end can differ depending on the application. So if it's like that BMI application, if you just want to transfer the data to a behavioral computer that's tracking the monkey's intention, for example, well, those are just kilobytes per second or kilobit per second data rates. So much more manageable regime. In fact, so low you can transfer that all wirelessly over Bluetooth if you want. But if you want to keep all the images, which is what we usually do for kind of scientific purposes, so not the raw radio frequency data coming off the probe, but then the kind of once we combine everything and turn that into these blood flow images, those are in the regime of about tens or at most hundreds of megabits per second. So again, that's a bit more, but nothing that you can't land on a pretty standard hard drive these days. And in fact, that's exactly what we do. We have a very standard Tower PC that does all of this, and then the kind of specialized hardware is in the acquisition machine that's crunching it all down.
We're talking mainly about data for bandwidth, not the storage. Is storage an issue with what you're doing?
It can be for science. So because we're going to try to store as much of the kind of more on the raw side of the data so we can reprocess it a million different ways. And that's very, very valuable data if it takes months to train a monkey what to do. So we end up storing quite a bit. And I think we're up to like 80 terabytes of data now, but those 80 terabytes are, you know, over the last 3.5 years. So it's a lot, but it's really not even considered big data by the true big data people. So it's an issue, but it's not a big one.
Great. And Sean, and I mean, Sarah, your talk was mainly about technological limitations, right? Sean and Aaron, do you want to jump in with any thoughts about technological limitations?
Yeah, I mean, one thing in my area, which is kind of interesting, is that it's not that hard to come up with a new diagnostic measure or intervention. It's extremely hard to do the large-scale clinical trials that are required by the FDA. And so there's a lot of hysteresis where, you know, groups that have, you know, products that, you know, they've been selling, you know, fight really hard to prevent any competition. And then there's also a large bureaucracy in terms of, you know, applying the right gold standards. And so I think what happens is that, like, for instance, there's a recent brain training company, like Kelly Software, they actually got a cognitive training approach for ADHD through the FDA. It took about $100 million in a decade to do that, which is, on one hand, an accomplishment. On the other hand, it's just painfully slow, because you think about, you know, what are all the other things that could be brought forth with the same amount of funds? Or, well, if you had 10 years to come up with new ideas, well, what would we be coming up with now as the best approaches, as opposed to the seed of the idea was a decade old? And so I think that's a problem.
Yeah, and for our work, interestingly, the technological area is not as much a limitation. You know, it'll in the future as we get more data and we get better AI methods, we'll be able to address it. So, I think was already mentioned, we need more data to improve modeling. I'm not concerned about that. AI will improve. It's going to take time. But the biggest issue, actually, the biggest barrier is a behavioral barrier, where whether it's culture or implementation or political issues, things that are preventing the technologies from being implemented. And that's where starting off with this, we started off with our online community behavior change approach and figuring out how to, within an organizational setting, within a political setting, within what's going on with our country right now with the divide, figuring out how to use that behavioral science to make people more willing and open to try things, test them out and implement them is really the biggest barrier that we have. That just the data or science itself isn't enough to do the talking. There's a lot of implementation needs.
David had a really good question, and I'll start with you, Sean, but throw it out to the group. Is what really your research is focused on not just understanding but then trying to influence the behavior. So what kind of insights on a grand scale can we all learn from, on what kind of interventions have the greatest impact in changing human behavior?
I'm biased on the social side. I feel like interventions that incorporate community, like these online community interventions, interventions that we're not just doing something ourselves. We're not just given a technology and assume the technology is going to work to change our behavior, but we're doing it in combination with other people, whether it's through social support, competition, some kind of collaboration. That I think is the way to at least create sustainable behavior change. We can definitely, through developing a really nice designed technology that works well, you can get people to use it once, to use it for a few months. But I think we really need to incorporate social aspects in order to make that long-term sustainable and create the behavior change that'll stay.
What's the most successful intervention that you've seen work like that?
That's a good question. I mean, I just narrow down to the research that we've done, and I'm trying to think of products, and I don't know, there's so many products that have been around for decades and things. But in our research, for example, that online community I mentioned that we built, it was in 2009. We built an online community organically from scratch using the science components that I mentioned. We ran it for 3 months, 12 weeks. We had the peer leaders, and still today we stopped the study, but people continue engaging. They provide support for each other. And so I think that science of creating a community, if you can create this organic community, it'll sustain.
Anyone else want to?
Yeah, well, I agree with Sean. I might just point out kind of an alternate perspective. And so the, cognitive skills, really influence every way that we process information. And so what I think probably the most effective interventions are on the side of education, because early on, if there are more effective ways to develop people's cognitive skills, then throughout their lifetime, they'll be picking up information in different ways. And that I think that can have profound effects. And so I wouldn't ever say to do that instead of the social approach, because I think that they're 100% complementary. But I definitely think that the earlier you start with some of these approaches to kind of understand what different individuals, kind of cognitive skills are and the ways to enhance them to help them through the educational process. I think this is an opportunity that has been missed in traditional education.
Anyone else want to jump in? We had a question from, let's see, Dr. Pete Kusabe about how how this will be impacted by or change in the metaverse, in particular, Sarah, the moderation. What will that look like?
Well, I think that with that particular strategy that Facebook has unveiled, there's a larger strategy around trying to solve for the content moderation problem. And it's one that they've been trying to implement for some time, which is to reduce the likelihood of people sort of just interacting willy-nilly in unintentional community. And instead being within community contexts where there are expectations around behavioral norms already that are maybe shared. So you could be in a community where the expectations around that are fairly fluid and loose, but there's sort of like a social contract with everyone who's in the community that's acceptable. And as long as the content doesn't really break the rules of the platform itself, but if it's more challenging or disturbing or edgy or whatever, that's fine. And it can go all the way the other way. And they do want to use the metaverse, for example, for business applications, right? So the expectation would then be that people behave within those metaverse contexts as they would in any other professional context. And the idea here is really to take a lot of the pressure off of the kinds of content moderation that happens through kind of serendipitous interactions on these platforms, recommender systems that serve up content that that people don't really want to see and then report, etc. So there's like an offloading that will happen with these other constructs, and it's actually a pretty significant change to the business model of what they say they're all about, right? So if they're about connecting the whole world at any given time, moving to these other kinds of intentional smaller communities is actually really a different type of interaction. Now, from like a health standpoint, a social health standpoint, I think the newer model is probably a much better one. But the thing to keep in mind here is that none of these platforms ever intended to be in the business of content adjudication, and they all want to desperately get out of it and lower the need for it. So you can read a lot of these like new strategic moves in the light of, or against the grain of this multi-billion-dollar problem, which is how they kind of contextualize content moderation. And hundreds of thousands of people doing the work, massive amounts of technological resources thrown at the problem to do the automated type of work, and we're still catch as catch can. So there's this idea of changing the actual social engagement context, and that's probably a necessary piece of the puzzle.
Great. So
if I can just ask a quick follow-up on that. So if I were to read back your response and give my initial impression of it, given that this notion of a metaverse is going to be a kind of cross-cutting infrastructural innovation like electricity has been over the decades, is it the case where you're not going to just have a Facebook persona or a LinkedIn persona where, because the metaverse is just going to be out there, you would abide by, like you said, social norms as you would in quote unquote normal day-to-day context, that you wouldn't just kind of let your Facebook rage out of control and you keep in check. Okay, thanks for confirming that with head nods. Thanks.
I think that's the idea, and the other point of connection that I'll say there too is that that's Facebook's approach. That's one approach, and other firms are looking at other ways to kind of have this, again, meta, this aggregate persona or set of personae that you use on social media across platforms. Right now, the norms kind of allow for you to embody different ways of being on different platforms, which many people have need to do. But remember that Facebook is very much about this, like, legal name, one account to one person. We found out through the Facebook files that that's actually not how it's going down, but that's, kind of their espoused desire. And so there's like this real push towards sociality through the affordances of the platform.
I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about how much we can trust the data. You know, especially when I was looking, Sean, in your talk, you had the map, and you see New York having really high heat map, and then, you know, also Vermont and Massachusetts, and then Connecticut is just white. It's like, okay, there's no way that just over the border there's no there's no data. Or, you know, when people are tweeting something, there's a lot of bluster, you know, and how much of it is really true. Maybe Sean, you can take it first, but all of you, you know, I think everything that you're working on depends on the integrity of data. How do you manage that?
Yeah, I think the example of, was it Vermont, or in that case, that slide was probably the states were white if they had nothing to report. So there were that's an issue with data. I think there are two ways. So one, the more data that we get and the better the models, I'm confident we'll be able to address these things. It's just a lack of data. Right now, for example, when I was presenting work on predicting opioid use or HIV based on behavior, we of course don't know whether the people who are searching on Google for opioids or tweeting about sexual risk behaviors, whether they're actually going to do that. Right now, we're just looking at correlations. And so there's a ways to go, but I think as we get more and more data and we record gold standard data on people's behaviors and what they do in the future, and these are some of the things we're trying to do. You know, we have two types of studies. One are hundreds of millions of data points about people where we don't really know much about the individuals. Then we have small samples of 200 people where we know a lot about what we're going to do. And in the future, they're going to converge, where we'll use these small data sets as training sets to be able to look at populations at a large scale of, you know, millions or hundreds of millions of people. So that'll be the future. That's going to take a little while. Yeah, as in this interim point, we are limited by the data that we have always.
Well, it also strikes me that there's cultural differences, right? So when I was looking at the MIT versus or the university map, right, like it seemed like a lot fewer of the MIT students were happy, right? But also just from, if it's still the same as when I was a student there's a weird cynicism. There's a cultural difference between students at MIT, I think, than some of my friends at other universities, right? We tend to talk in more cynical tones. Maybe, you know, I come from a Hungarian background where there's a saying that says, you know, Hungarians have fun by crying, you know, like there's just very different. I think there's differences in that. So I wonder, for all of you, if you could talk a bit about how do we ensure that our algorithms and a lot of these approaches take into consideration those cultural differences, take into consideration equity and diversity. The training takes into consideration the different perspectives that we bring to it.
And just to clarify, so people don't read too much into the MIT, or so MIT doesn't come back at me and start yelling at me. But it was a snapshot in time. So what we're doing is constantly we were reading tweets at any given time. So that image could be completely different just 10 minutes later, because everything was happening.
Sure. But I think the question still stands, right? Is that hypothetically, if one university, the students, there's a culture of complaining, but you're not necessarily unhappy, right? Or if a culture, you know, women speak differently than men generally, or not, you know, we don't know, but there's a lot of differences across cultures and genders and backgrounds. And there has been a lot of talk about equity and making sure that our algorithms are fair. Any thoughts from the group?
I mean, one thing which I could add, and this relates to the project I mentioned that was looking at executive functions to benefit Black and Latinx school children in math, is that typically cognitive assessments have been used to promote a deficit-based model. So, you know, you basically find that one group does worse than another group, and that therefore you put them in a special ed classroom where they don't have the same opportunities as the kids in the other classroom. And that one of the things that has been a big component of this research is how do we move away from that? And one of the biggest ways to do that, at least within our framework, is instead of trying to come up with population models where, here's one population compared to another, is to try to come up with individualized models. And that also to change it from the perspective of, do you have a problem, to, is there a need? And it's not particularly easy to do this, and it's definitely kind of a work in progress, in our domain. But, I think that some of the issues, both are just rephrasing what are we trying to do with the data, and in this case, in a way that is, enabling as opposed to, putting people into boxes they can't get out of. But then the other thing that gets to the previous question is, how do you avoid garbage data? Because when it comes down to it, like for the types of things we do, we want to come up with some estimate that's related to how well people can focus or remember things or see things. And that if they're not engaging with the task in the way that we expect them to, we might get a poor result. And so a lot of, I think, work is needed just to make sure that for the particular question you're trying to address, is the data actually informative? Or, are you ending up with, noise that's related to some other variable that ideally with enough data you can start estimating? It's hard, I think.
Thank you. We only have 2 more minutes, and I was hoping, okay, Sarah, and then what I'd like is each one of you give just a 1 sentence, a prediction of your field or whatever, just short 1 sentence.
I'll do that. This will be that.
Okay, great.
Yeah. The issue of this cultural nuance, which is what you're bringing up, which is at the fore of the problem for content moderation, is the reason that the human beings are still involved, because they are so much better than machines at discerning the nuance, the cultural, linguistic, regional, like symbolistic nuances that are present. And machines just do not equal that just yet. So my prediction is that humans will be a fundamental part of this activity, even when they are in concert with machines, which they are, and with computational tools for a long time going forward.
Thank you.
Sarah, that was going to be my concluding statement. All right. Can I go then? Can I go just to build on that then? Because in response to people who are afraid that AI is going to be replacing humans, and maybe that'll come at some point, but especially in the field of healthcare, things like that, we need this person-to-person interaction. We need to be able to be in the real world with each other, to see each other, to touch each other. We learned that during COVID, for example. And so I don't think at any point in the near future are machines going to be replacing humans, especially in areas like healthcare.
Thank you.
I guess I can go. I think that neuropsychiatric cognitive disorders, a lot of things that have come up today, all fit under a banner of brain circuit disorders at some level. So human behavior does start at the brain. And we think that technology, and specifically our technology, starts as a device for measuring phenotypes and progression of brain circuit disorders over time. But there's a future in which we can also use neurotech to treat those disorders without the system-wide side effects and poor efficacy of pharmaceutical interventions. So I'd like to predict a future where precision neurotechnology is the first treatment, and that people are only rarely considered technologically refractory rather than medically refractory before they try drugs instead of the other way around.
Love it.
You just said my prediction much better than I was going to say it, so I'm just going to say yeah.
It's just one big mind meld. Do you want to add anything?
Maybe the other is, I think a lot more of this is going to get into people's hands. So I think that to the extent that right now, there's a lot more fitness information that people are getting from smartwatches, and we have apps to help track that. I think some of this neurotech is going to become more accessible and more personalized. And I think that's going to be a revolution.
This was fantastic. Thank you so much, everybody, for your time across disciplines. Such a great reflection of everything going on in LA, and also just very nuanced insights that I think we can all learn something from and translate into our business lives and our personal lives. So thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah. Now I'll reframe Z's comments. It's in SoCal. We have people from all over, especially LA as well. Yeah, it's okay. It's amazing representation today, and thank you all for participating. Thank you all for tuning in. We are recording this, and I will repost this to our YouTube channel, where it can be then fully moderated by humans as well as machines, and hopefully we don't get banned for that picture. I'm not a laughing matter, but it's a serious concern. But and we'll have this up here on our website as well, reposted. But thank you all so much, and I put the emails of all the presenters in the chat. If everyone saw that, if you didn't see that we came in later or it disappeared because our chat's weird, just let me know. I will send you all the information, because the most important thing here is for folks to reach out to these amazing researchers and learn more about what they're doing and get involved, and to help them get their breakthroughs out there to the market and other places. So that's the real hope. And then maybe you can also inform products on their side and their research going on at their industry level. So with that, I think and also of course Z, thank you for moderating and pulling all these great sort of variations on a theme together and making sense of it for all of us, and helping us all learn more about human behavior. Great. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Well, that we conclude. Yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank you.